Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you're all doing well. In this week's episode, we're going to be talking more seascapes, so if you missed last week's episode that you can check out here, you're not going to know that I had so much to say that I needed to break it into 2 episodes. In this episode, we're going to be talking about ND filters to get your exposure longer, to get the perfect water in your images. We're also going to be talking about what to do with your bag or the accessories you're going to need when you're on the coast that you just don't think about until you're actually there. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about more and more compositions. So here's me visiting that same location for a 3rd time, and you'll have to wait and see if I get any images worth talking about. Hint, I definitely do. So let's get started. All right, so we're back at the same spot we were yesterday, and I planned on shooting a bunch of B-roll and a bunch of compositional stuff where I didn't talk, but literally as soon as I came down the stairs, I saw a composition that I wanted to talk about, and let me just show you really quick. All right, so this is a prime example of one of those S-curves that I was talking about in those rivers that come out of the hills, and it comes down, and while there's a lot of tracks here, and there's a lot going on in the shot that isn't necessarily perfect for what I want to take, just look at how great this shot looks just on video. You've got this nice, really nice S-curve here of the river that leads your viewer's eye through all of these nice sea stacks here. You've even got the left of the frame filled up by these. You can even cut out the house here, but it's got these nice yellow flowers. And you can imagine some nice color in the sky. This is actually a really great composition and exactly what I was talking about when I was talking about using those rivers that come out and add some foreground elements into your compositions. So again, be on the lookout for those. We're gonna head to the sea. If you're asking why I'm not taking this shot right now, it's specifically because I am too particular and I wouldn't want all of these tracks in the shot that you can see. I think that those would go away in some rain or some higher winds, and this would be a great shot for sunrise specifically. So let's get out there. Okay, so I'm going to continue to talk about compositional stuff throughout this video, but I wanted to get in the next tip while we talk about other things because there's just an endless amount of stuff to talk about when it comes to compositions. So the next one I have for you is the gear or the stuff that you're bringing as accessories for shooting seascapes. One thing is you keep watching me put my backpack here. I'm in the same spot I was yesterday. You just watch me put it down. And something important is that I just keep it as far away from the coast as I can where it's still accessible. So the first night I was here, the tide was actually coming up to and hitting this rock and splashing, so I actually put my backpack way up here when I wasn't accessing it. Yesterday, I put it here and I checked back a few times, and there was one time the tide came in here, made me a little worried, but it wasn't a big deal. So that's just something to keep in mind. I highly recommend you don't carry your bag out on the water, just because there's been times when it splashes up on the bottom, or if something happens, you fall or anything like that, you're gonna end up losing everything rather than just maybe your camera or maybe nothing if you can get your camera out of the water fast enough. I highly recommend you just always keep your bag away, but still in reachable distance.
If you're worried about theft, I mean, realistically, the beach only has a few people on it at a time, and most of the time, no one's ever gonna harm your stuff. So I know that's a concern, but I feel like the chances of that happening are much smaller than the chances of me falling in the water out there. A few other things are tripod. This is a very interesting one. So if you have your tripod in that salt water continuously, it is going to eat away at it pretty much. So what I've chosen to do is use a tripod that is like my secondary one, my not as nice one, and I've just dedicated that one to being the one in the water, which is why when you've seen me filming, it's my green tripod. It's a little bit less sturdy, it's a little bit lighter than my main tripod that I use when I'm shooting out of the car. That's what this camera is sitting on right now, and I have my green tripod right here, and I basically have just dedicated that to being my ocean tripod, just because it is so grungy. I'll put a shot up on the screen, and this is only from a couple weeks of shooting out on the sea. The salt starts to build up. It's definitely gonna rust some of your components, and mostly what it's gonna do is cause a bunch of sand to get into the gears where you lock those heads, and it is nasty sounding. It means I need to clean my tripod more often, which I have to figure out how I'm gonna do in the car, but something to keep in mind. Okay, something else you're gonna want when you're out by sea is a microfiber cloth, but you're gonna want more than one. Don't do what I did and only bring one. You're gonna want at least two, because this one is probably gonna get wet or gross or something, and you don't wanna rely on just one. So make sure you bring at least two of these so that you can continue to wipe down the lenses or anything, your camera. I was wiping down accessories yesterday, and splashes will happen or sea mist is gonna happen, and you're definitely gonna want more than one of these, for sure. All right, speaking of sea mist, another thing is you want to leave your bag shut. So don't leave it open like this and go off and shoot. Make sure you shut your bag every time you leave it, because what's gonna happen is, even though you can't really tell right now, or especially in the camera, or even with my eyes, you can't really see the sea mist that is hitting over here on land. If I turn around and show you out here, you can see it looks a little bit hazy, but you really can't see it when you're close up, so you don't actually know what's happening. But what's gonna happen is, if I leave my bag here for an hour and a half or an hour while I'm shooting sunset, it's gonna collect all of this dew or water or sea mist on the outside of the bag, and it's definitely just not like a pure water, it's a slightly salty water. So if you don't end up closing your bag, everything in your bag is going to get wet. I highly recommend / don't make the same mistake I did and leave it open. You're gonna wanna shut it every time you leave it, and just make sure it's closed, especially just for peace of mind, but specifically on the coast, because of that sea mist and that stuff that can happen, those elements that are here that you don't even notice. Definitely make sure you do that. All right, so the last little thing here in terms of checklist for equipment or random things you might need for Seascapes is kind of weird. One is definitely a towel in your car, or bring it out with you in your backpack. I cheat with this just because I live in my car, so I obviously have a towel, but having a towel for when you get back to wipe off all your stuff, to wipe off your bag, to wipe you off if you get too wet or anything like that is really convenient. And the other thing is that at some point you're gonna have to clean your gear. There's a great tutorial that I think Nick Page did on YouTube about cleaning gear. Basically what you're gonna end up doing is using like alcohol wipes or some level of isopropanol wipes on your camera and on your equipment to kind of get rid of all of that salty water that ends up splashing up on it or just being out in the elements. Highly recommend you check out that video for helping clean your gear, and I think he also has one to clean your tripod, both things that I've used in the past to clean my stuff. So keep that in mind. It's not necessarily gonna change any of your photography while you're on the coast, but if you do shoot enough seascapes, you're gonna have to do it. Otherwise your gear is just gonna end up falling apart. So that's gear stuff, extra gear. The last tip that I have for you in this video is gonna be about ND filters and that specific gear to get your shutter speed longer. But I think what we're gonna do is talk a little bit more about some compositions, and I'll kind of mix in some of that ND, hopefully, and we'll talk about longer shutter speeds and using those in your compositions as well. I wanted to include another tip, which is some apps that I've been finding super useful for shooting on the coast. The first one is an app called Windy that, as you guessed, is great for predicting and knowing the currents of the wind. It also looks really sweet too, but it does a lot more than just wind now. It does rainfall, predicting your forecasts. It does swell and surf and tide. It pretty much does everything you could possibly want it to, and it's great outside of shooting on the coast. It's great for almost everything. The interface for it is really beautiful. It looks really good, but it also has a wealth of information. It has forecasts using all kinds of different models, and
again, for the coast specifically, it's good for wind, but also the tide, swell, and surf. Speaking of tide, swell, and surf, you can also use an app called 𝐒𝐸𝐚𝐫. That one's been really great for predicting swell and surf, which is good for helping your safety when you're on the coast. But Windy also handles all of that now. But I like to have multiple apps in case one of them goes down when I'm out in the field. And last but not least, I just wanted to say that if you wanted to support me by more than just liking or subscribing to my channel, there are links down below for print sales, and there's still 3 slots left in my Colorado workshop. You can also find down there at the time of filming this video. Anyways, let's get back to the rest of the video. All right, so compositionally, we set up in the same spot as we did last time, but I'm not locked into this spot. I really just wanted to stop and point out the weather, since we talked about weather last time as well. And you can tell the conditions are very different than yesterday. It did not rain today, really at all. However, it is pretty clear on the horizon. There's not as much particular sediment and stuff in the sky as there normally is. It was cloudy, windy today, but this is a lot more atmosphere on a day where it hasn't rained than I've gotten in a long time. There's a lot of cool stuff happening in the sun there, but I'm not particularly in love with this shot as much as I was yesterday, considering these conditions. So I think what I'm gonna do is look around a little bit more for another composition, shoot a few more compositions, and hopefully have time to talk about taking longer shutter speeds with an ND filter system, or what you're gonna need to do that. So let's look for more compositions out there. Well, here, not out there. All right, so the composition I've settled on is pretty much very similar to the one we had before, except I am now in portrait mode, and I'm shooting the little hat with this in the foreground in portrait mode, because I don't really care about anything that's happening on the horizon in terms of the light, so I don't want to capture any of that. And all the light that's happening back here could turn out, but considering how dark those clouds are, I don't think it's going to happen. So this is the perfect time to talk a little bit about your filter system. So I've done a whole video on filter systems and what I recommend that you can check out here. But in terms of shooting seascapes, what you're going to need is an ND filter that'll give you about a 1 to 2 seconds, a 1 to 2 second shutter speed. And what that's going to do is just give you a lot of, I've been waiting for the water. Hold on. Oh. Let me check my thing here. Not what we wanted. Okay, back to talking about the filters. So, you're gonna want an ND filter that will give you a 1 to 2 second exposure at about f/16. f/16 is just the generic number that is best to shoot at if you possibly can. And landscape photography, obviously f/8 and f/11 are also great to get a lot of stuff in focus. But many times in these situations, you want to try to avoid focus stacking if you can, and f/16 is going to give you the best way to do that. Now, the other thing is, it depends on the amount of light you have. Obviously right now, I'm shooting with a 3-stop ND, but what I'm going to recommend is you get a 5-stop ND. That's going to cover most of your bases. And the thing about ND filters, here we go. I'm going to take a few, I'll be right back. All right, so I've been waiting for like 10 minutes for that water to come up there. That was the first time, so pardon the interruption. Back to talking about ND filters. So the biggest thing is, if you only have to buy one ND, my biggest recommendation is a 5-stop ND, like I was saying. And the reason that is that's gonna give you the most versatility when shooting seascapes like this, especially during sunset. I've noticed that at f/16, ISO 100, and sunset, about a 5-stop ND is good enough to get a 1 to 2 second exposure. Obviously, if you're shooting into the sun, might have to be shorter than that. And if it's things like this right now, I had to bump down to a 3-stop ND that I happen to have. Oh, water's coming again. I'm just gonna take some shots while I talk. And I had to bump down to a 3-stop, but the important thing about ND is if you only have to buy one, you can always increase your ISO a little bit to get your shutter speed where you need it to be, but you can only go so low with your ISO. So for example, if I wanna let in more light on a 6-stop ND, I can increase my ISO. But if I'm on a 3-stop ND and I'm at exactly f/16, I can't go higher than f/16, or I shouldn't, because of it just ends up making the image look worse. I can't remember what the diffraction, I think it's called diffraction when you're above f/16. That's a topic for another time. And I want a shutter speed of at least a second at f/16 at ISO 100, and I'm blocking 3 stops of light with a 3-stop ND. With a 3-stop.
Okay. With a 3-stop ND, I just have to, look. Where's she going? Okay. Anyways, back to the video. With a 3-stop ND, what was I talking about? With a 3-stop ND at ISO 100 at f16, you might not be able to block enough light. So you want to overcompensate, have a little bit more ND if you only want to buy one, so that you can increase your ISO and capture more light in there. Again, if you're going to ISO 400, it's really not going to be a huge deal. But if you can buy more options, buy more options. That's the ND that you're going to want. I'm not going to tell you to buy a system like this. I'm not going to tell you to buy a magnetic one, which are great, by the way. You can watch my video, like I said, on it. I linked it before. That you can figure out all on your own. What you're going to need to know is that you're going to need about a 5-stop ND to get the water how you want it. And that's going to do wonders for your photography. I'd pretty much use it at all points as I'm taking Seascapes. All right, so you probably noticed I got pretty flustered when that person walked behind my camera while I was filming, and I just completely lost my train of thought talking about ND filters. Something I wanted to keep talking about was that it's not a hard set rule to have your shutter speed be stuck between 1 and 2 seconds. It's just a nice general rule that when you walk up somewhere, that's going to give you the best options for when you take the photos, especially when you're learning to shoot Seascapes. For example, this image was taken at a 1/5 of a second, and this image from last week's episode was taken at an 1/8 of a second, and I even kept my aperture at f16 and boosted my ISO to 250 like we just talked about in this video. And it's just really important to know that the speed of the water is going to dictate your shutter speed, and there's definitely a right and wrong to your shutter speed when you're shooting water. A lot of the times, if your shutter speed is too fast, it's going to look too crispy and you're not going to get that movement you want. And if your shutter speed is too slow, it's just going to be completely washed out with white. Something you can do out in the field is check the back of your camera. Take your images when the first wave comes in, see if there's too much white or too little movement on the back of your camera, and either speed up or slow down your shutter speed based off of that. Sometimes you're really just not going to be able to tell, and the best thing you could do is just take both. Shoot some at 1 second, shoot some a little bit faster, and shoot some a little bit slower. And then once you get home, take them and learn from them. Review your images, learn from those shutter speeds, and say, wow, every time I took a crashing wave, 1/5 of a second was much better than anything slower. And anytime I was shooting those waves that were slowly moving in and creating leading lines in my images, I wanted about a 1 second exposure. So keep those things in mind. Definitely make sure you review your images. And all right, so very briefly, I just want to cover this composition in a little bit more detail now that I've gotten some waves to come in. What's really cool is when you look at it normally, obviously there's some water that's receding right now, but it just looks like this rock and the sea stack behind it. What will happen is when those waves come in, it changes every single time when I'm taking exposures. Sometimes the waves will clash into each other and create these ripples that create leading lines in a 3-second exposure. Right now I'm taking 4-second exposures, and a big wave just came in and created some really awesome leading lines right past the camera, which is happening in the background a little bit. But other times when the waves are a little bit softer, what will happen is they come back and they hit each other right here and create some leading lines as well. I'll put that on the screen now so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about, because you just can't see it until you actually snap the photo. And that's what's really interesting about Seascapes, and it goes all the way back to what I was talking about with trying to pre-imagine or imagine what things will look like once you've snapped the photo, rather than what it looks like just as a still image right now. For example, like this doesn't look all that interesting, but when you add that long shutter and you add those foreground elements, like this little, whatever the heck this rock thing is, and it's creating that thing that the water is catching on, and it creates those curves on this in your image and stuff like that, it can be really beneficial. So those are the kind of things you have to look for and think about preemptively that you'll learn as you shoot more and more slightly longer exposures on the sea, to see how the water interacts on objects, how the water interacts with itself, and how the tide ends up interacting and creating compositions on your scene. Also, the light back here is majestic, but so small in the frame that I'm not necessarily sure I could even capture it. I might try to though. I think I'm gonna change up compositions now after one more wave. Maybe this one right here. So like I was saying in the video, I wasn't totally in love with the conditions I was being presented, so I didn't expose that many images while I was there, but I am gonna review 4 of the images that I took of that composition you just watched me set up and shoot. In this first image, or the first and second image, these are both 2-second exposures, and they're both with the water receding back into the ocean. In this first one, you can see there's a nice blanket and textured effect above that object in our image, and it almost has a nice leading line to our sea stack, but it's not perfect. In the next image, you're gonna see it's similar, same exposure time,
but the wave is not interacting in the same way. And this just really brings home that point that you have to take a lot of exposures when you're sitting there watching the waves come in and out. Something I highly recommend you have that I did not have in this video is a shutter release cable, so you don't have your hand on the camera to take your images. I got away with being able to just turn on my touch screen, tap to expose button pretty much, but even that I don't recommend. I just was being lazy, trying to film and everything like that, and I didn't set up my shutter release cable. You don't want to have your hand on the camera or touching the camera if you can get away with it, just so that those longer exposures don't have any movement. You're already dealing with the waves moving your tripod and stuff like that. You don't need to add another variable of your hand. So that's the first two images. Speaking of longer exposures, the second set of images is with the waves coming at us, well, at least for the first one. But both of these were taken at 4 seconds, not only to let in a little bit more light as the sun was setting, but also to create this nice, really cool effect on the water. And it was like I was saying before, it's not a hard rule to shoot between 1 to 2 seconds. Sometimes you might want to go longer just to see what it looks like. In this particular image, it works. With those waves coming at us, it's creating a nice, really cool effect on the water. There's a lot of glassiness almost, and that object in the foreground looks really good because it's kind of creating just a little bit of hint of something there rather than just having the same thing all the way through the bottom of the frame. And in the next image, it's with the waves receding away and going back into the ocean. And this was probably my favorite image from that night because that blanket effect on the object in the foreground I just absolutely love that look. And then it also is leading your eye to that sea stack in the background pretty perfectly, and everything just lines up really nicely for this image. However, again, the conditions were not what I wanted them to be. But I will say I came back for a fourth night and I did get the conditions that I want. All right, quick wardrobe change because I'm getting ready for sunset. As you can tell, it's happening now. And I haven't seen the sun in a couple days, so I'm really excited to shoot sunset or just stand out here in the sun and it not be raining. Anyways, let's talk about those final images from that final day. I will say I didn't film anything for that final day, mostly because those compositions just didn't change. I didn't have anything else to really add. I was just going back to the same exact spot and taking the same shots that you've already seen in this video and the past video. But let's just jump into Lightroom and I'm going to show you some of those and show you really what I was trying to get and that I was talking about in this video and the past video, just so you have an idea of exactly what I wanted in terms of conditions in the wave formations that were happening in front of me. So this first image doesn't really have any waves in it, but I just wanted to show off that nice glossy texture on the sand and how it's creating a really cool reflection, plus that nice little sunburst and that little flare that's happening in the image. I think it was actually an error or a mistake because there was something on my lens or one of my filters, but it actually ended up creating something that I really liked, just a little bit of a unique flair to the image, if you will. Anyways, let's get into some of these waves. So as you can tell, the conditions for this, the sun started to set behind the clouds and didn't really look good if I was shooting into the sun. So what I tried to do is move a little bit to the right of that sea stack and capture the atmosphere that was happening behind the sea stack. It also really worked with some of the waves that were happening, and I didn't end up shooting any images that have that rock in the foreground, mostly because the waves and the tide were much higher than previous nights. Anyways, let's look at these first two images, and I'm gonna guide you through my thought process as I was shooting these images and changing up my composition to better enhance the composition or the conditions I was getting in front of me. You'll notice in this first image, the horizon line is basically dead center, and I have the wave going up to the sea stack, and it looks pretty good, but I started to realize I don't need as much sky in the image. It's not giving me anything else that I'm really drawn to, and I really want more wave in the image to help lead my eye through the image. So in the next one, I kind of tilt my camera down just a little bit, even though I keep that landscape orientation, and the waves in this one are far more exciting, and there's a lot more happening, and I like the way that it looks in terms of leading my eye through the image, and I actually think this is probably a portfolio-worthy image once I show you the final edit after I'm done talking. It's these next images that are really important though, because I did these and I started to think, I want more wave. I want more of a leading line through my image, and these landscape orientations just aren't doing it for me. So I switched my camera to portrait, and I start shooting basically the entire 2/3 at the bottom of the frame with the wave and only 1/3 of the image in the sky in that sea stack. So in these, you're gonna notice just different variations of the wave and how important it is to take multiple exposures of those waves to get that perfect leading line. So in this first image, again, all of these are at 1/8 of a second pretty much as I look through my Lightroom here on my phone. Some of these are at 1/6 of a second, but barely any difference. A lot of these are also f11 rather than f16, which is not necessarily as important because I don't really have a foreground object. The waves being a little bit out of focus isn't the end of the world if they are, just because they're already moving in the first place. But I'm pretty sure my plane of focus is pretty big regardless, just because I'm shooting pretty far up and shooting portrait mode down into the water. So these first couple images, just pay attention to the leading lines in the images. This first one that wave is just almost too close to the edge on the left. Maybe if I cropped it a little bit different and cut out a little bit of the bottom of the frame, it would look a little bit better. In this next one, I really like how unique the wave is and the line it's creating, but that little indent in the wave just distracts me too much, and it's not as strong as the previous one. The next two are the same exact wave, just taken right after each other as I'm holding down the shutter button. And you're gonna notice that the leading line in these is also very strong, but the problem is there's no bright spot in these waves. There's no particular part of the wave that I really want to look at like there was in the previous ones with a lot more interest and more turmoil in the wave that's causing a lot more of that blur. So even though these look nice, they still aren't the wave that I'm looking for. It's not until this next image that it really takes off, and this is probably my favorite image from the night. It's actually probably one of my favorite images from shooting on the coast altogether. And it's the perfect leading line through the image, and it just leads your eye right from the bottom of the frame all the way to that sea stack without having to crop or anything. On top of that, the conditions in the sky are absolutely perfect, and I just love those tones in the sky and the texture on the wave. And again, you're gonna see this final edit when I am done talking, but that is basically what I wanted to say about those compositions. I also ended up taking like a 10-second exposure, which is pretty interesting, that I'll just put on the screen or talk about in Lightroom to show you that you can get a lot of those almost mystical, not mystical, ethereal feels when you take longer exposures as the sun is setting. But I wasn't particularly in love with the composition. I just wanted to use that as an example. And then lastly, I have this last image of a really cool wave as the sun was setting and those conditions kind of left the sky, and I was just taking some images that I thought would be interesting, but not necessarily anything that was gonna be portfolio worthy. So those are the images. That's the last night, and I finally got the stuff that I was looking for. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that that was informative, and I hope that putting all this together made sense. And I probably have some more content to talk about seascapes just because I've spent so much time by the sea. Anyways, here are the images. I hope you enjoy them. I would love to know what you think down below. These are some of my favorite images that I've caught probably this entire year. So thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. I'll see you again next week. Later.